the very simple requests of those patients, and we received over 200 responses, and they were quite poignant, as you can imagine. And I also thank the hundreds of you who are watching this by webcast, and this webcast also will be available on our organization's YouTube channel for viewing for others who were not able to be with us here today. Just a quick note, we do expect to have time for questions at the end, and so hope that you will hold them till then. Just before we begin, a quick note. We are quite fortunate to have a couple of distinguished individuals here with us today. If you'll raise your hand or stand, we have Kimberly Miller, who is in Senator Harry Reid's office. And we're thrilled that she could be here to represent Senator Reid. And we also have Will Capo, who is with Congressman Joe Kennedy's office. If you'll stand or raise your hand, Joe, we're very, very pleased to have members of Congress and the representatives here with us today. We're here today to discuss an important topic, which is what do we need to do now in the aftermath of the Institute of Medicine's report on myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, published just 6 weeks ago. I'm honored to have with us today the eminent scientist and scholar who chaired the MECFS committee that toiled as volunteers to write this rigorous report. Dr. Ellen Wright Clayton is a professor at both the law school and the medical school at Vanderbilt University and holds both a JD and an MBA. And she founded there the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Society. She's published 2 books and more than 100 scholarly articles and chapters in medical journals on the intersection of law, medicine, and public health. She's an active participant in policy debates, and she's advised the National Institutes of Health and other federal and international bodies. She's an elected fellow of the American Academy of the Advancement of Sciences. And I could go on and on about her resume, but I will tell you, among her most extraordinary achievements, the one that won my heart, is that she has become convinced of the importance of forward movement in solving this dreadful illness. And I will tell you, it's not every scientist who will speak in a forum like this, which is really about a transition from a scholarly report to policy and action. And when I called Dr. Clayton and asked her to do this, she did not hesitate for a moment. So I'm thrilled to have you here with us today, Dr. Clayton. There you
go. So it's an enormous pleasure and honor to be here to talk about this study. And I'm going to start by saying a couple things at the front end. First of all, this is the most comprehensive, most thorough analysis of the literature and response to patient voices that has ever been published on this particular topic. It provides a firm foundation both for making the diagnosis and more important and equally important for future action. So I just want to start out with that. Okay. This report was commissioned in response to the Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Advisory Committee to promptly convene at least one stakeholders workshop in consultation with CFSAC members to reach a consensus for a case definition. Now, I want to be really clear here that this is what CFSAC wanted. What our funders actually did was something somewhat different, and I realize that that's a source of some contention, but they contracted with the Institute of Medicine to develop evidence-based diagnostic criteria for this disorder to address the needs of health providers, patients, and caregivers, considering the various existing definitions and other diagnostic issues. We were also asked to consider the desirability of new terminology for this disorder, and we were asked to develop an outreach strategy to disseminate the definition and a plan for updating the new criteria. Now, here I want to make a comment about IOM studies. The Institute of Medicine convened a group of very diverse people, including patients, including caregivers for patients, one of whom is in the room here, Ron Davis, including experts in this disorder, including experts in a number of other disorders, and in experts in research design. So it is this diverse group of people who, after extensive discussion, after extensive review of the literature, developed this research definition. So this is a multifactorial, multidisciplinary process. The other thing to say about the Institute of Medicine process is that we do the work that we have been asked to do. We do not go beyond the work that we have been asked to do. This is something that is important in Institute of Medicine research. And so I just want to identify that the scope of our task is defined by the statement of task. We did a lot of things. We had 5 different meetings where we met. We had 2 public sessions where we had testimony from patients and experts. We reviewed almost 1,000 public comments, which we did carefully and systematically to ensure that we were adequately taking care, addressing the issues of patients and advocates. We had input from the CDC multi-site clinical study. We had been told to look at the P2P process. We were unable to get that data. We also had consultants who talked about communications and statisticians who summarized, who looked at some of the more complex statistical analyses that were undertaken. And we did a comprehensive literature review. Look at these dates, January 1, 1950 through May 30, 2014. This is a lot of time. We developed inclusion criteria, looking not only at articles that focused on the diagnosis, but also looking at the quality of the research that went into that. We started with almost 10,000 articles. After a lot of analysis, we looked more closely at almost 3,000 articles. We ultimately found a fairly small number that actually met the criteria for our work. We also looked at almost 1,300 articles that were submitted by people submitting comments to us. So, a tremendous amount of work looking at lots and lots and lots of articles and data. Our key messages are this. One is that this is a serious, chronic, complex, multi-system disease that can profoundly limit the health and life activities of these patients. This is a serious disorder. And that doing a thorough history, physical exam, and targeted workup are necessary to determine a differential diagnosis and often sufficient for the diagnosis of this disorder. So our first recommendation is that if a physician goes through the diagnosis, and I'm going to talk about the criteria in just a minute, but if people meet the criteria for this disorder, they ought to be given the diagnosis and not another diagnosis. They need to be given this diagnosis, and that there needs to be a change in the ICD-10 to reflect this diagnosis. I realize that this is something for the actions of others to take care of, but one that's actually very important in this setting. So here are our criteria. I know that all of you probably know this, but just to rehearse them really quickly, there needs to be substantial fatigue, and not just feeling tired, but fatigue that is chronic, severe, and that gets in the way of your ability to do your activities of daily living, and that even if you can push through it, that nonetheless it leaves you exhausted. So a major issue here. The post-exertional malaise, which is the inability to replicate exercise on more than one occasion, unrefreshing sleep, which is something that virtually every patient with this disorder has, and then at least 1 or 2 of the following manifestations, either cognitive impairment, which is the inability to think well. We heard from this very frequently, or orthostatic intolerance, the inability to stand up or sit up for a long time without becoming faint or dizzy-headed. These criteria we picked because they are virtually always present, and they are virtually always present in combination. And so that's how they became the core criteria. That is not to say that there aren't many, many other symptoms that people with this disorder have. And this is not an exclusive list. This is just a list of some of the many domains in which patients with this disorder can have symptoms. And so it would not be a mistake to say that this disease is protean in its manifestations, but it has core symptoms that need to be present in order to make the diagnosis. I want to give a reflection here. These slides, if it looks like this, it means that it's my thoughts. The other ones are IOM slides. So I'm clearly signaling when I'm talking as an independent person here. Reading this literature, it is really clear what this disorder is. Listening to patients, it is really clear what this disorder is. It jumps off the page. And so this was, although, we had a lot of discussion, it was not hard to come to consensus about what the core symptoms are, because it is just, you can't miss it. So I'm just reflecting that. Treating the symptoms, we did have a 6-month threshold for making that diagnosis. We do recognize that people who have this disorder have disorder for the preceding 6 months. And what that means is that people who have symptoms need to be treated, whether they've had them for 6 months or not. They may not qualify for having the diagnosis yet, but that doesn't mean that they don't deserve appropriate care and treatment. Our second recommendation is that the Department of Health and Human Services should develop a toolkit for screening and diagnosing patients. It is the view of the committee that probably somewhere between 80 and 90% of patients with this disorder are not diagnosed. They must be diagnosed. They must get diagnosed, and they must get into treatment. And that part of what needs to happen is develop the tools to make that happen. And that they need to be available for every clinical setting where these patients are seen, which is everywhere. Primary care, everywhere. It is our hope that these tools will educate clinicians and other providers. We want them to understand that this is a serious disorder. We want them to understand how to diagnose it. We hope that no one ever hears again the statement, is this disorder really real? It's real. So let's get over that one and get on the business of making the diagnosis. The Institute of Medicine has already published a clinician guide that's available on our website, and as well as summary materials, as well as the whole report, which you can download for free as a PDF or which you can buy. But this is available to everyone, but the PDF is available to everyone for free. There is no excuse not to learn what this is. And then I'm going to give a shout out to a YouTube that was created by Dr. Cindy Bateman, who was on our committee, who's done a wonderful YouTube discussion of the report and how to make the diagnosis. It takes a while to watch it. It's over an hour long, but boy, it's an awesome discussion. So I just want to alert you to that too. And that, by the way, was a personal recommendation. This is not from the IOM. This is just from me, okay? Our third recommendation was that these criteria need to be revisited in no more than 5 years. We recognize that our criteria now represent the state of the science at a moment in time. It is our fervent hope that the science is going to move forward. It is our fervent hope that soon we will know more about what causes this disease. We will know more about subtypes of this disease. We will know more about how to treat this disease. It is either hubris or stupidity to say that a statement at one point in time is the vision of the truth that is going to last forever. But particularly in this disorder, it is our fervent hope that this community will know more soon. And to that end, there needs to be another literature review, and there needs to be another assessment of the diagnostic criteria, and that it needs to undergo the same kind of rigorous process that was undertaken here. And we also recognized, and we also, because we were asked what we thought about the current name, we addressed that issue. And we thought that chronic fatigue syndrome has not served these patients well. I can't tell you how many comments we had where people said that. We also thought that myalgic encephalomyelitis, as much as people liked it, didn't work because it doesn't describe what this disorder is. There is a long history in medicine of coming up with names based on symptoms when you're not clear what the etiology is, which is what we think the state of the science is. This is the name that we proposed, but we came up with this because that's what we were asked to do. So, I mean, I'm just putting that out there. We also did address the issue of pediatrics. Turns out this disorder is common in kids, and it comes at a terrible time because they're mostly teenagers, and teenagers who miss out on being teenagers have an almost irreparable loss. They miss out on school, they miss on all the developmental tasks that are going on with teenagers. And so we wanted to call that out. We found that there was sufficient evidence that orthostatic intolerance and autonomic dysfunction were major factors in them, that they do have evidence of neurocognitive disorders. They have a very high prevalence of the other symptoms. And importantly, this is a group in which it is very clear that Epstein-Barr virus, which causes infectious mononucleosis, appears to be a major trigger in these young people. We also identified a number of comorbidities with these disorders. It is crazy to think that if you have one diagnosis that you can't have another one. I mean, most adults may have diabetes and hypertension and chronic renal failure and many other disorders like that. And to say that because they have diabetes, they can't have all the other things is really crazy. So we want to identify that people can have other things. And that for that reason, we did not identify exclusionary criteria because we think it's possible to have more than one thing. If you have the core symptoms of this disorder, you have it, you can have other things too. So I just want to put that up there as well. Obviously, I've already talked about areas that need further study, including etiology, pathophysiology, and effective treatment, and that really more needs to be learned. So I want to have some thoughts going forward. It is my sincere hope, and indeed I think the sincere hope of everybody on the committee, that people are going to use this report to say, this is a serious, complex illness. It makes people sick, and it's really bad. And we need to learn more about it. We need to identify it. We need to treat it. We need to develop more effective treatments. And I think the fact that this study was funded by Health and Human Services, AHRQ, the CDC, the Food and Drug Administration, NIH, the Office of Women's Health, and the Social Security Administration suggests to you that there are a lot of branches of the federal government that are interested in these questions. So go talk to them. It's really important. And it's really time to fund more research into this disease's causes, defining subtypes, and effective treatments. I can't emphasize that enough. Focus on what the main message of the report is. This is a disease. We know how to diagnose it. We need to learn more about it. That's the main message. And people getting distracted by other things are missing an amazing opportunity that they need to grasp. And this will require stronger advocacy in and outside the government. So this is the cover, and we opened a door. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. The challenge now is to go through that door. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clayton, for your candor and the work that you've done. I agree that the publication of this report is one of the most important days in the history of this illness. With its preeminent roster of scientists and experts, rigorous methodology, and forthright conclusions, this is the substance that we, who care deeply about this illness, have long needed. Again, I'm Carol Head, president of the Solve ME/CFS initiative. I'm also a patient. I was quite sick 30 years ago for many years, and I know personally the deep despair of being very sick, not knowing why you are sick, receiving no help from conventional medicine, and being dismissed and ignored. However, I'm one of the very, very fortunate few who has mostly recovered from this disease, and I understand full well that I dodged a bullet, that so many of the people who were sick at the same time I was all those many years ago are still sick. I'm proud now to serve the Solve ME/CFS initiative. It's the longest-standing organization in ME/CFS in the United States, and our mission is to make ME/CFS understood, diagnosable, and treatable. And I'm proud of our Solve ME/CFS Biobank, an asset for all qualified researchers in the ME/CFS SEID community. And I'm proud of the research that we've funded over the last 7 years. I do want to do a quick call out of thanks to Mary Dimmock for allowing me to use some of her research in the data that you'll see in my comments here today. I would also say our organization does not purport to represent all patients. No one can do that. But we do purport to use rigorous research, evidence-based data to obtain additional research funding for SEID. To be clear, that's why we are here today, because it's time for our government to increase funding and support for this disease. We believe that the IOM report is a turning point in the history of this disease. So here's a summary of what I'd like to talk about with you today. First, what does the IOM report change and why is it important? Then some background on ME/CFS. I think there are many folks, perhaps some in this room and perhaps others who are watching online, who may not have the deep familiarity with the illness that we do. Why does this disease matter to all of us, to everyone, not just patients and their families? At what levels has NIH funded ME/CFS research? And frankly, most importantly, what needs to happen now? So what changed 6 weeks ago when this report was published? Well, for all of us who are patients, this report is like confirming that water is wet. We already knew that water is wet. We already knew that the illness is real. To quote the IOM report, and as Ellen just said, it's a serious, complex, multi-system disease. In its most severe form, this disease can consume the lives of those whom it afflicts. But we patients who already know this are not the audience for the IOM report. The audience is legislators. Thank you for being here. Doctors, federal officials, and private foundations who now see the official stamp of approval that, yes, indeed, this is a serious, debilitating physical disease. We believe that this report is the defining moment for two key reasons then. First, the federal government has now clearly affirmed this, that it is a disease and not a syndrome. And for the millions of Americans who've long suffered with skepticism and lack of care, the affirmation alone is deeply helpful. And for the doctors, nurses, and medical researchers, this definitively places this disease in its rightful place. And therefore, there now exists no credible barriers to significantly increasing medical research funding for this disease that will lead to treatments and cures. Federal agencies and private medical research foundations now have a bright green light to move forward with substantial funding, commensurate with the number of Americans who suffer with this illness. The seriousness of this illness can now only be refuted by those who choose to be ignorant. And at the same time, what didn't change 6 weeks ago when this report was published? Well, ME/CFS continues to be that complex multisystem disease that is still at a very early stage of medical research and understanding. It can be reasonably debated whether this disease has aspects that involve the immune system, neurological system, genetic components with epigenetic effects, viruses, endocrine systems, bacteria, brain and spinal cord inflammation, and many others. Rigorous research has been done into all these areas, with many compelling and interesting research results, but nothing yet definitive. And importantly, there are very few research dollars available to replicate even these most compelling findings. Also, ME/CFS research is not far enough along to be of interest to pharmaceutical industry funders. The potential sources of private funding are quite narrow and utterly insufficient to solve this complex disease. And of course, we know, the other thing that has not changed is that hundreds of thousands of patients continue to suffer in deep pain, usually without a diagnosis, locked inside bodies and minds that are no longer able to serve them well, and almost always without a doctor who can help them, and with zero FDA-approved drugs or therapies. I think of William, who became ill with this illness in 1986 at age 12 and was diagnosed 5 years later at age 17. He was unable to attend high school but obtained his GAD with the highest score ever in his state. He's now 29 years old and is now often too ill to prepare or consume his own meals, speak on the phone, or write with a pen or pencil. It's quite common that he's housebound for weeks at a time. He's quite sensitive to light and noise and therefore often lives in a sort of sensory deprivation. And of course, he is in constant pain. It's been 17 years. William wrote, "I am among the more severely affected, those in the lower 25% of functioning. Is our country willing to let so many lives like mine be left like detritus on the highway, largely ignored? The loss to the nation and to the world is uncalculable," unquote. And there are hundreds of thousands of Williams who suffer intensely, and we can and must change that. For those who are somewhat new to this illness, this disease, I pause for a moment to consider, why has this disease been so poorly supported with federal funding for so long? I mean, it is puzzling. So first, as Dr. Clayton has mentioned, most people have not believed that it's real. The most common patient experience is to be told, even by medical professionals, that it's all in your head. Get over it. Buck up. I was told that. We don't tell people with MS to get over it and buck up. We don't tell people in end-stage cancer to get over it and get on with their lives. We take those diseases seriously, and we show compassion for those who suffer with them. And that's what patients who suffer with this disease need and deserve. Second, the name of the disease, as Dr. Clayton has mentioned, has kept it from being taken for the serious, debilitating disease that it is. It's generally been called chronic fatigue syndrome. Well, first, we don't usually describe diseases by a symptom. For example, we don't call lung cancer chronic coughing syndrome. To quote the IOM report, ME/CFS patients, quote, are more functionally impaired than those with other disabling illnesses, including type 2 diabetes, congestive heart failure, hypertension, depression, multiple sclerosis, and end-stage renal disease. So having called this serious disease by an inappropriate and frankly lightweight, insulting name is one of the factors that has kept doctors, friends, family members, employers from affording it the seriousness that's warranted. Third, the disease has been poorly defined, which means that diagnosis can be difficult. That's not at all uncommon in a multi-symptom complex disease with symptoms that appear in other illnesses as well and can be difficult to measure objectively. There's no simple blood test. There are no simple genetic tests for diagnosis. Some of the newly discovered biomarkers are few and cannot be done yet routinely in a doctor's office. And as it's genuinely complex and difficult to diagnose, Doctors face an overwhelming amount of information to absorb. They have 15-minute appointment slots in their days that are already filled with time and financial pressures. With this new IOM report definition of the disease, which is clearer and simpler, diagnosis can become much more straightforward. Fourth, this disease has been incorrectly described as a psychological illness, and still is in many, if not most quarters. This mistaken attribution of a physical illness as a psychological illness has often occurred historically with diseases that are complex, and particularly when the primary sufferers are women. Certainly, we recognize that psychological illnesses are real and cause extraordinary pain. We do not disparage psychological illnesses, but it is simply not true that ME/CFS is among them. This IOM report clearly puts that long-standing, damaging misconception to rest. And last, most medical professionals demonstrate little understanding of the illness. Dr. Lenny Jason has clearly documented that most medical school textbooks and schools do not present meaningful information about the disease. So even new medical school graduates today either are not informed or are misinformed. And a 2013 meta-analysis of 34 studies reinforced the patient-reported themes that they have experienced as they've sought medical help of stigma, challenges in getting a diagnosis, skepticism, minimization, and misunderstanding on the part of medical providers. Again, the IOM report emphasizes the importance of our medical professionals being properly informed about this complex disease. So all 5 of these core issues were addressed in this rigorous IOM report, and that's why this report is a seminal moment in the long and painful history of this disease. So next, why should we believe that this issue should matter to all of us as Americans, not just patients and their families? The ME/CFS SEID economic burden on our nation is significant. Our government has estimated a $17 to $24 billion economic burden on the nation due to lost productivity, indirect, and direct costs. The slides that scrolled across the screen with comments from patients earlier on emphasize time and time again that what patients want most is to rise from their beds, be productive, and eager to work, and to lift the burden of their care from others. This is patients' most fervent wish. And there are so many who suffer. The IOM has estimated 836,000 to 2.5 million. The CDC had estimated 1 million Americans, and certainly there are millions upon millions upon millions of individuals around the world who suffer with this illness. This is not a rare disease. I have a chart now that is from the Institute of Health, and there are 4 columns. I hope you can see them. On the left are listed 5 different diseases or illness conditions. Then we have the funding for those diseases in 2014, this year, in millions. Then we show the estimate of the number of Americans who suffer with the illness, and you do the simple math, and you have then, in the right-hand column, the dollars spent per patient. So we see, for instance, with lupus, that it's $283 per patient, multiple sclerosis, $255 per patient, and ME/CFS at $5 per patient. And this is taking the more conservative $1 million patient figure. If we used the 2.5 million, obviously the funding per patient for ME/CFS would be much lower. So you see from this chart that on a percentage basis, spending for ME/CFS patients is 2% of what is spent on lupus. 5 is 2% roughly of the 283, 2% of what is spent per patient on MS, and 9% of what is spent per patient on autism. Certainly, these are all serious medical problems, and we don't disparage in any way our government's commitment to spending on them. But I simply must illustrate the enormous disparity in spending. It is not incremental. It is not small. It is orders of magnitude disparity in spending. So this next slide is a little challenging. and it needs a little explanation. These are figures from 2014, again from NIH, in which they summarize the total NIH spending for 242 diseases. So imagine a long list. On the left-hand side is this rank order by dollars spent. In the middle is the condition or disease. And on the right-hand side is the spending. For instance, we see cancer at number 7, with certainly a very reasonable number for spending on cancer in the billions. So I thought I would take a look down this list that, as we will recall, has 242 diseases listed. So we don't see ME/CFS yet here on this slide. Here's the next group. Now I need my glasses. That takes us down through 39. Many illnesses and diseases here. No sign of ME/CFS yet. Let's keep going. Now we're down to number 59, and we're at spending down at the bottom with urologic diseases at $494 million. No sign yet of ME/CFS. Then, in the interest of time, I will skip the many categories ranked 60 to 99. Okay, let's pick it up again. Here are the diseases ranked 100 to 115. Let's see, no sign of ME/CFS yet. And again, in the interest of time, we will skip categories ranked 116 to 180, because I will tell you, ME/CFS is not there. Okay, we're getting toward the bottom now. So here are the diseases ranked 181 to 196. We see a lot of things there. No sign yet of ME/CFS. And then we're going to skip, again, a large group, 197 to 229. And I will tell you, we do not yet ME/CFS. And at long last, in the very bottom ranking, the bottom one at 242. And if you look up, you see in brown the chronic fatigue syndrome spending, again, at $5 million. I find this shocking. And I will tell you also that this, I would note that federal spending for hay fever is higher than federal spending for ME/CFS. And I will also say that the 2014 spending figures we've just reviewed are not an anomaly. When we look at the ME/CFS research budget in the period, the 14 years of 1999 to 2013, it roughly averaged $5.5 million. When we look at the broader period, 1987 to 2012, spending on ME/CFS has actually dropped by 27%, even while total NIH funding more than doubled. So, understanding the economic burden on our nation, the suffering of our citizens, and the new disease validation from the IOM report, what now? With this new report, there are so many actions that can be taken to do right by patients, our family, and our nation's economy, and I ask here today only 3. First, provide funding for biomedical research and studies commensurate with the disease burden. That is, use research dollars to aggressively advance understanding of disease etiology, pathology, diagnostics, treatment, natural history in patients across the spectrum of disease severity, patient age, race, and socioeconomic status. This, the math on this chart is really simple algebra. If we wanted to spend per patient the same amount that we spend on, say, lupus and MS, that figure, do the algebra, it would mean that we would spend roughly $250 million per year on ME/CFS. That is not an unreasonable figure. It is a difficult figure, but it is not an unreasonable figure. We note also that researchers are ready. Our research organization and the many other universities, clinics, and nonprofits who struggle with minuscule research budgets and yet have done extraordinary research can significantly accelerate the pace of discovery. By far, the primary source of basic research funds in our nation's history has been the federal government. That's its right and proper role, we know that, to serve the medical needs of its citizens. And that's what the NIH has done with fantastic effectiveness in other diseases. But at $5 million in research spending and the estimated cost on our economy of $17 to $24 billion, the economic cost to our economy is more than 4,000 times our government's current spending on MECFS-ID. I challenge the Office of Management and Budget and HHS to find a more effective use of incremental federal funds than to support research in MECFS. And as we know, the MECFS community does not have a massive lobby. We're here. We do not have established budgets of meaningful size so that we can incrementally build in 5 or 10% more each year. But what we do have now is an IOM report commissioned by our own government that documents the desperate need to put up against the minuscule federal budget. A sea change must occur in federal spending. Further, just to, when I can manage to sort of pull back from the experience we have in our organization of talking regularly with people who are in extraordinary pain and difficulty, you know, this is a fascinating medical research problem. This is the kind of complex problem that attracts brilliant, inquisitive researchers who thrive on using rigorous science to attack complex problems. And there are researchers standing at the ready. Some of them are in this room. Additionally, there are new informatics technologies used in other diseases that can parse through large, complex data sets which reveal insights that are not obvious to we humans. These extraordinary advances in informatics and other areas of medical research, not available even 5 years ago, are all ripe to be applied to this complex illness. This is a medical problem that can be solved. It can be solved. Our second request is that the government remove institutional and organizational barriers within the federal departments. We need a strategic and tactical plan and commitment to solving this disease across agencies, perhaps even an MECFS czar. One immediate change that could be made is to change the location of the research component of funding for this from the Office of Research on Women's Health into one of the NIH institutes where there are stronger budgets and more ability to advocate. Perhaps it's NIAID, which is immunology, or NAIDS, which is neurology. But the point is that this disease needs an institutional home in the federal government that's appropriate and can advocate for dollars and action. And our third request, as called for very explicitly in the IOM report, is to accelerate education of our nation's medical professionals. The patients cannot wait. This means, among other things, updating the CDC's primer and acting on the IOM report's recommendation to disseminate information about the disease to medical schools and to working professionals. This is eminently doable with appropriate funding and a thoughtful implementation plan. In conclusion, this is my favorite quote from the IOM report. This is from the IOM report. So many people have suffered for so long without medical help and compassion. Along with 1 million other Americans and their loved ones, I believe that this is the beginning of the end of this deplorable tragedy that's not worthy of the American people. I think of Cheryl. Cheryl, who was a top student and an athlete, who's now in her early 40s and has been sick for 20 years. She had sudden onset of this illness in 1995. She got her MBA from a prestigious school and promptly became sick. She's in her early 40s, and one of the tragedies that's rarely spoken of is obviously now she and her husband have chosen that they cannot have children. That's an entirely reasonable choice, given the depth of this illness. She also was just diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma several years ago and went through 6 rounds of chemo. She's now clear of lymphoma, but continues to barely be able to function and care for herself, again, with the MECFS. When she was asked to choose between the lymphoma and the MECFS, a horrible choice, she didn't hesitate. She'd take the lymphoma. And as awful and frightening as that was for her, she found therapy, she found compassion, and she is now clear. But the path forward with ME/CFS is anything but. After 20 years of pain and difficulty, she continues with no end in sight through the end of her life. Now, as she has said, lymphoma can kill you, but ME/CFS will allow you to linger in a dark, hellish twilight for the rest of your days. And there are thousands and thousands of Cheryls and Williams. And we talk regularly with those patients in our organization, and it truly is heartbreaking. This definitive IOM report has once and for all declared that we must commit to funding research to eradicate this dreadful disease. Now there can be no excuses from our nation's health agencies that haven't funded research at a level commensurate with the economic burden it places on our nation or in comparison with other diseases. And no excuses from anyone, doctors, patients, families, coworkers, who dismiss this devastating suffering of 1 million or more of our Americans. You know, our society's understanding of this disease, frankly, now, is where its understanding of, say, MS or autism were 30 years ago. Very poorly understood, largely dismissed, with great skepticism about the cause. I don't know if you remember, I remember growing up that autism was blamed on cold parenting. It wasn't considered a real issue. It was the parents' fault. And MS was generally dismissed as hysteria. I think we all, any of us, now that we're better informed, feel remorse for that now unimaginable insensitivity to the suffering at that time of those with with autism and MS. And such has been the inhumane dismissal of those who suffer now with ME/CFS. One day, this skepticism about ME/CFS and the poor treatment of those who suffer will be equally unimaginable to everyone. With this highly credible, scholarly IOM report, now is the time to commit to solving ME/CFS. Thank you. And now, it's my honor to introduce activist and actor Morgan Fairchild. Morgan has enjoyed a career which spans 53 years on stage and screen. She's an Emmy and Golden Globe nominated actress who's made a name for herself as an activist supporting AIDS research, women's rights, and the environment. She's testified before Congress on AIDS and the environment and has been a repeat guest on such shows as Nightline with Ted Koppel, Hardball with Chris Matthews, The O'Reilly Factor with Bill O'Reilly, and Face the Nation with Bob Schieffer. Her interests are eclectic. She has an interest and expertise in foreign policy, paleontology, emerging viruses, and epidemiology. And she's known for her ability to articulate often difficult issues in a way that's accessible to we regular people. She also worked closely with then Surgeon General C. Everett Koop to help educate the country about AIDS and testified before a special congressional committee in 1985. And here's my personal favorite about Morgan. In 1987, she appeared before a U.S. Senate committee in which she explained the concept of global warming to the senators. 1987. This,
they didn't listen.
They still don't. This is her first ever speaking engagement on ME/CFS, a subject that is near and dear to her since she suffered with this disease many years ago. Morgan, we're so grateful that you're willing to speak publicly about it with us here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone for coming out. I really appreciate it. Obviously, this disease has not gotten the kind of attention that you would like, and thank you for so many great researchers being here. I feel like an idiot. Here I am, Dr. Barbie. But it's the kind of thing that we really do have to pay attention to. I know a lot of you will be thinking, why is Morgan Fairchild talking about this disease? It's because Morgan Fairchild has had this disease. And I am here to tell you it is real. And it is certainly no day at the beach. Carol was kind enough to mention some of my activism on AIDS in the 80s. That came about because of one of my odd hobbies is emerging viruses and epidemiology. I follow everything. So I'd been following what became known as AIDS since it was 13 cluster cases of Kaposi sarcoma in New York, and then 11 cluster cases of pneumocystis pneumonia in San Francisco. And I knew something new was out there. And so I just read everything I could find about it. And suddenly then when Rock Hudson got sick and America started paying attention, I was the person they could turn to that was a famous face that could go on Nightline and explain how a retrovirus works and why you can or cannot get it this way. And I felt it was very important to step up because, again, in this case, it was a controversial disease that was getting a lot of backlash, and a lot of people didn't want to look at it. And I did work with Surgeon General Koop and Tony Fauci at NIH very hard trying to get it taken seriously as a disease that was going to affect a broader population. There were a lot of really interesting new diseases back in the 70s and 80s. We had Lyme disease, you had mad cow disease, you had AIDS, but so was chronic fatigue syndrome. So I had read a lot about it. I studied it. I read everything. I thought it was so interesting because there was no real way to diagnose it, no cure. Nobody knew what it was. I never suspected I would be diagnosed with it. In 1989, I just finished shooting a movie in Portland, and it had been lots of cold and lots of snow and lots of all-night shoots. And I came back into LA and thought I had a sinus infection, ended up going to my ENT, who ran some tests and came back and told me I had chronic fatigue syndrome. And I said, well, I can't have chronic fatigue syndrome. He said, well, you have elevated Epstein-Barr virus. Aren't you tired? And I said, honey, I live tired. I mean, I run like a mad woman. I've just come back from shooting for weeks, all-night shoots. Of course, I'm tired. But I did have those elevated Epstein-Barr levels, which was one of the diagnostic markers back then. So suddenly, chronic fatigue syndrome was no longer just a fascinating case study. I was one of the cases. And yet, I didn't feel that bad. I was functioning okay. But that hit later. The real fatigue hit later. And when that hit, I mean, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I would just couldn't do anything. Anything was too much. For anybody in this room who hasn't had this, everything is overwhelming. Doing anything is too much. I learned to really pace myself and to save myself for work. What I do, fortunately, requires getting there on time and knowing your lines. I got to a point where I'd always been one of those people who could just look at a script a couple of times and I had my lines. I was spending days and days with my acting coach just going by rote on my lines so I would not embarrass myself on a set. And then getting there, fortunately, unlike theater, a movie, you work in spurts. You rest for a long time while they're setting up, and then you have to have total focus when they're there. And I could pace myself, and I could get through my kind of job doing that, but I learned to save all my energy just for that. I got through because of a few things. First of all, I had a boyfriend who was very supportive, unlike a lot of people. But number one, also, I was very lucky that I apparently had a mild case. When I read some of the things and I talk to people who have gone through such horrible things, I consider myself very lucky. It was really set me back, but it was nothing compared to what a lot of people have gone through, some of these horrible symptoms. The second thing was I was diagnosed early. Before I was even really tired. I was diagnosed early, and I had a doctor who didn't think I was nuts. This helps a lot. Having someone who actually tries to recognize what it is, who told me I had it, and was supportive and tried to help me find ways to deal with it. And third, because I've been doing my job since I was 10 years old, I can sort of muddle through. I didn't lose my job like many people have had to quit work. And I was able to muddle through and keep making a living and show up and get through the day. But this was a real growing experience. And one of the things I learned real fast is who my real friends were. And I discovered a lot of the groups that I'd been working for, charity groups that I'd been working for years, doing speeches, doing public appearances, suddenly got mad at me because I couldn't show up. When I got sick, I didn't get too many words of sympathy. And this is from people I'd been helping out for free for years. And that's when I really realized sort of the credo for my rest of my life that my mama from Texas always used to tell me, which was, they'll step over your dead body in the gutter and find another blonde. And you just realize where you are in the cog in the system, and that you're the only one who's going to take care of you. You're the only one who can stand up for you. You're the one who's going to have to take charge of your treatment and your health. And when you are befuddled, it's a little difficult to do. But it's also one of the worst things about this business is that people tend to think you're just a flake or you're a bum. As even my dermatologist, who's brilliant, when I was last week when I told him I was coming here, he says, well, you know, I'm tired too. I don't want to hear that anymore. People don't understand, and this is a doctor, and he's a good doctor. He's not this specialist. He's a dermatologist, but still, doctors should be being trained in this. They should not be dismissive of patients. It's that kind of thing, because I'd always been one of those people who was, go 90 miles an hour all day, every day, and I mean, it was like I hit a brick wall and knocked myself out, and it was not a fun way to live. And have I mentioned the brain fog? I mean, it is like you are in some old Sherlock Holmes movie out on the moors with the hound of the Baskervilles with the fog. I mean, you just can't think of things. Nothing comes. Words won't come. Thoughts won't come. Connecting ideas won't come. I mean, I've always kind of prided myself on having a rather extensive vocabulary. And suddenly I couldn't think of words. I couldn't get sentences to come together. I wasn't expressing my thoughts. And if I hadn't seen you in a while and I ran into you somewhere, I would know the face, but I just maybe couldn't put the name with it. And I'd always been really good. I mean, I was famous in L.A., put me in a party, I know everybody's name. Suddenly, I just didn't. I found that suddenly I had to write down everything. And I'd always been one of those people who could keep everything in my head. Suddenly I had to write down appointments. I had to write down notes. If I was talking to my agent on the phone about a business deal, I had to write everything down. I never had to do that before. Even simple conversations with people, like we're going to meet on a date next Monday, I'd have to write it down because I might totally forget about it. And I was the queen of Trivial Pursuit. I mean, I was like every answer in Jeopardy, and all of a sudden I'm having trouble putting all of these things together. But the day I knew I was really in trouble was a day I could not remember my own mother's phone number. This is a woman I talk to every day, and you have to understand this phone number had been my phone number since I was 9 years old in the house we lived in, and suddenly I could not remember my mother's phone number. This disease devastates lives. I was very lucky. Carol was very lucky. We got past it. I never truly suffered all the devastating side effects that so many people do. I had a milder case. I never missed a day of work. I did not have a relationship that fell apart. I muddled through, but many people that I knew have had a much harder time. I just covered it well. But as you've heard today, there are maybe 2.5 million people in this country suffering with this disease. The major economic loss just from lost worker productivity is devastating. I know so many people who have or have had this disease, and some of whom are famous, some of whose names you would know. I won't say their names here, but some of whom you won't know their names, but are major players in my industry and just out there in the rest of America. I have one friend who I have met online on Twitter who had been doing much better and texted me just as I was on the plane yesterday to come here that he's had a relapse. No one talks about it publicly. Nobody wants to be identified with it. Nobody wants people to think there's something wrong with them, or as frequently common, that you're just looking for an excuse to get out of something. But so many times, I'm going to tell you, people sidle up to me at some buffet at a party or come over to me at the hair salon, ladies, and say, quietly, I hear you've had CFS. I have it. I don't have anybody to talk to. I don't know what to do. My doctor's not helping. Can I talk to you? Or my cousin, or my wife, or my husband. somebody they know has it and they're trying to help. And the one thing that I found that I can do is I can listen, and I don't think you're crazy. I can listen, I can tell you some of the things that worked for me, some of the things that I found helpful. I don't know that you will, but I think that I found helpful. And just having a sane voice to talk to that isn't judgmental, that is welcoming and supportive, means so much to patients with this. People suffer. Real people suffer because of this illness. Real marriages break up. Real jobs are lost. Real pain and desperation exists because of this disease, and we must address it, just as we pulled together back in the day on AIDS, on other diseases that came about that nobody understood at the time. But we pulled together, we found out what caused them, we're working on processes to help alleviate either the symptoms or finally find a cure or a vaccine. And this is why we're here today, just standing before you, asking for your attention, because all this has slid under the radar for way too long, because this is a real disease and it causes real devastation. So we just need the powers that be to give us focus and funding. Focus to help educate doctors, educate the medical profession, educate patients, educate the public so that if someone comes up to you and says, I have this, that you don't think they're crazy. And to do the research for a cause and to find a cure. And then we need the funding to pay for all this because, honey, the science ain't free. Research ain't free. Progress ain't free. But if we can just get it all together like we've done on these chronic diseases before us, progress is what we need. Progress is what we can have. Focus and funding, and that's what we need. And thank you for anybody out there who can help us achieve that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Morgan. That was just terrific and inspiring. Thank you so much. So we do have time for some questions. Geraldine is in the back there with a microphone. If you want to ask a question, if you would please give your name, and if you have an affiliation with an organization, please let us know. And they can be questions for any of the three of us, and we'll do our best. Do you guys want to come up?
This is for Dr. Clayton. Dane Cook, University of Wisconsin, and VA in Madison. So I realized that the charge of the committee was for clinical criteria. But considering the comorbid conditions, can you comment on the concern among many that allowing for comorbid conditions that have large overlapping criteria will muddy the research water rather than clarify what the pathophysiology of the disease is?
Obviously, that's a great question, and I will and I'll answer it in my personal hat. I think that obviously as you develop research cohorts, you're going to want to define what the comorbidities are and sort of be able to control for those. I mean, I think that's clearly the case. What we were most concerned about was a lot of the previous diagnostic criteria, particularly, well, they were all about research, not about clinical, but that probably is slightly overstating it, but a lot of them had exclusionary criteria that said, well, you had to exclude depression, you had to exclude this, you had to exclude that. And the fact of the matter is that kind of approach that says that if you have to exclude all of these other disorders meant that a tremendous number of people who actually have this disorder aren't going to be included and aren't going to be studied. So I think you have to come up with research designs that identify comorbidities and control for them. But to say that that a lot of people have said previously is that this is a diagnosis of exclusion. Our view is that that's emphatically not the case. It's a diagnosis to be made, and that if there are comorbidities, they need to be identified and treated. And that will complicate research, but you know, it complicates research all the time. Many people have more than one thing. While you're waiting for a question here, I do want to make a comment that this process, working with our panel for our study, was really an amazing one, to get people with this many different areas of expertise in the room to come together on a unanimous report on this topic, to come up with unanimous agreement on diagnostic criteria, unanimous agreement on our recommendations, was really an amazing process. And one of the reasons that I enjoy working on IOM panels is I get to learn a lot. I learned a tremendous amount about this disorder with which I was familiar, but which I really didn't know as much as I do now. But this was really an amazing, dynamic, multidisciplinary panel that came to unanimity on this report. It was really amazing. So, okay, I'm sorry. Someone had a comment.
Thank you for your presentations. Can you hear me? Carol talked about William, a severely ill patient who suffers from a number of neurological issues, light sensitivity. They can even be sensitive to touch, and so sensitive that they struggle to have anybody even in the room sometimes. They may not be able to eat. Unfortunately, these patients have not been studied very much, which would mean there's very little evidence for their severity. Can you discuss at all how this was handled within the context of the panel and how that influenced what you came up with for criteria?
I think that one thing that we acknowledged was that there are people who, I mean, we did talk about sensitivity to sensory criteria as part of the things that this disorder can have. You know, clearly it was not our goal to come up with a research agenda, but again, speaking personally, it's pretty clear that there need to be protocols where the investigators go out to them and really study these highly severely affected people to learn more about this disorder. So, I think one of the questions that that we've talked about is, and one of the reasons, for example, we identified some tests that can come up with objective evidence to support this disorder, which we found very compelling in terms of defining the criteria. But it's really clear that there are a lot of people who can't do two-day, exercise tests. They just can't do it. It certainly doesn't mean they don't have the disease. But it was one of the reasons that we thought it would be cruel to require that in order to make this diagnosis that you have to tilt people and, put them through a two-day exercise test, which they can't do. We viewed the availability of these objective tests as providing evidence of the salience of these kinds of symptoms. But to say that everybody has to do this to get this diagnosis would be utterly inappropriate.
Give her a chance to come back.
Hi, I'm Donna Pearson, and I'm a member of the CFS Advisory Committee. I'd like to just continue on with the PEM discussion. Part of the concern is because obviously patients can't do the two-day CPAT, that doctors will misunderstand what PEM really is and will diagnose people who don't truly have it. We don't have objective testing for that. Can you speak to that at all?
We tried to be very clear in terms of what we were talking about and believe that a lot of these symptoms can actually be elicited on history. To say that, that if you, I think we said this really very clearly, that if people engage in a particular kind of exercise, that what they experience is what we heard many patients call payback, that they would have an extreme exacerbation severe exacerbation of their symptoms, such that they couldn't possibly engage in the activity again later that day, next day, week later, et cetera, et cetera. So we think that there are powerful ways to elicit that on history without making people do that.
don't mean to dominate the questions. So several have wondered what the IOM committee's role is going forward, certainly in December, and we greatly appreciate your candor and your coming forward and answering questions, I'm sure, for the past month. What is the committee's role as we try to roll out information to the public and educate the public on this? Is it something that you step back from now, or do you guys have an active role moving forward?
The fact of the matter is we were asked to make a report, and we did that. And that's how the IOM works. And so I came today because we were going to talk about the report, and I was going to have, and I'm delighted to hear that I'm going to have the opportunity to talk with CIFSAC and answer some of their concerns. And I'm delighted that I'm going to be going out to NIH to talk with Tony Fauci, which Morgan was kind enough to arrange. But the fact of the matter is our job is done, and it's only, and that's, how our work goes. Now, I think that it's fascinating that, first of all, not fascinating, I think it's wonderful that Solve CFS has come up and has picked up the ball. I think it's wonderful that Cindy Bateman did this YouTube thing. It is our hope that people will use it like crazy and improve it like crazy. We've done we've written our report, which was the best we could possibly do. I can't tell you how hard we worked because, it was really hard work. But that's our role. I have to say, I haven't worked on, I am a pretty hard worker. But I have to say, this was really something. It took a lot of time and effort and a lot of just, having us have these very hard conversations and very close look at the literature. It was, it was a labor of love, and which is how we do things at the IOM, actually. But it was, it was a big deal, and it's wonderful that people are picking up the ball and running in it. That was, as we looked at the literature and as we were really clear that we could come up with diagnostic criteria, we really, really want people to use it.
Again, thank you all for your presentations. As I listened to your presentations, I'm Barbara James with the Office on Women's Health. And as I was saying, as I listened to your presentation, I heard so many opportunities for research. All of you called for more money for research. But as you know, dollars are limited. So one of the things that I heard for people who cannot do the exercise tests, I'm thinking, oh my God, you have people with heart disease who can't do stress tests, but they come up with angiotensin that can induce the symptoms of stress tests. And I'm thinking, that might be something we can do. But is that really reasonable? So Dr. Clayton and Carol, since you are funding research and you're familiar with research, do you have any ideas or suggestions for a starting point with the research?
Well, there are so many needs in so many areas of research that it's hard to choose one. I will say I'm not obviously a physician in that particular. I think what you're talking about is finding a marker for one specific aspect of ME/CFS that's been used in other illnesses, and it's interesting. Hadn't thought about that, and I'd have to allow a physician to respond to that. We, as an organization, have designed a 5-year comprehensive plan using the concept of aggregating the data from very large numbers of patients and controls, and then looking at that information for those individuals across all the, I call them the OMs, the biome, the genetic component, to really look at all the different areas of research that may possibly, of the bodily function that may possibly contribute to this, this very complex multi-system illness. And we are not alone in having developed an extensive plan to do that kind of work. We've got a nice start with our biobank, and we've got a very clear roadmap going forward. And we are not alone in having a plan that can be funded. That goes back to the challenge of these discussions that we need to have with HHS and NIH about getting funding for these plans. Yeah. And we're really sort of taking the informatics comprehensive look at all of it together and trying to, tease out where we see patterns of data that would help point to the etiology and biomarkers for the illness. Yeah.
There's so many researchers here in the room, and I would point to Ron Davis, who's sitting almost directly behind you in my line of sight, who I've actually known as a researcher since I was a graduate school at Stanford many years ago, who I think that, clearly what we're going to need and what we see in a lot of major science today is getting large, well-characterized cohorts, which you can then, do research across a variety of domains. I mean, this is clearly, I think, a major strategy going forward. And as Carol has already said, there is promising research going forward already, some that's even come out since we published this report, and that, would have the ability to follow up and validate signals to understand the basic biology that underlies this disorder. But I would say that it certainly seems very clear to me that a very important issue is large, well-characterized disorders with biospecimens going forward. I mean, and Ron can tell you more than I can, but I think, and Dan can tell you more than I can. I mean, there are people in this room who can tell you more than I can, but I think that it appears to me that that's going to be the next step here.
Well, if there are no last call for questions, all right. Well, we are almost out of time in any case, and I think both Morgan, thank you so much for your personal story and your activism, and Dr. Clayton for your 18 months of work and your willingness to come here and speak with us. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us here today. And I hope that this is indeed a first step as we begin to think about how to work together to get the funding that's desperately needed. So, good day. Thank you. Goodbye.